Carneades arrayed his arguments concerning the criterion not only against the Stoics, but against all his predecessors. In fact, his first argument, aimed at all alike, is that by which he establishes that there is absolutely no criterion of truth, neither reason, nor sense, nor presentation, nor anything else that exists. For these things, one and all, play us false. Second, comes the argument by which he shows that even if a criterion exists, it does not subsist apart from the affection produced by the evidence of sense. For since the living creature differs from lifeless things by its faculty of sense, it will certainly become perceptive both of itself and of external things by means of this faculty. But when the sense is unmoved and unaffected and undisturbed, neither is it sense nor perceptive of anything. But when it is disturbed, and somehow affected, owing to the impact of things evident, then it indicates the objects. Therefore, the criterion must be sought in the affection of the soul caused by the sensible evidence. And this affection must be indicative both of itself and of the appearance which caused it, which affection is nothing else than presentation. Hence, we must say that the presentation is an affection of the living creature, capable of presenting both itself and the other object. Thus, for example, says Antiochus, when we have looked at an object, we have our sense of sight in a certain condition, and not in the same condition as that in which we had it before we looked. And owing to such an alteration, we perceive, in fact, two things, one the alteration itself, which is the presentation, and secondly, that which produced the alteration, which is the visible object. And similarly in the case of the other senses. So then, just as light shows both itself and all things within it, so also presentation, which is the primary factor in the cognition of the living creature, must, like light, both reveal itself and be indicative of the evident object which produced it. But since it does not always indicate a true object, but often deceives and, like bad messengers, misreports those who dispatched it, it has necessarily resulted that we cannot admit every presentation as a criterion of truth, but, if any, only that which is true. So then, once more, since there is no true presentation of such a kind that it cannot be false, but a false presentation is found to exist exactly resembling every apparently true presentation, the criterion will consist of a presentation which contains the true and the false alike. But the presentation which contains them both is not apprehensive, and not being apprehensive, it will not be a criterion. And if no presentation capable of judging exists, neither will reason be a criterion, for it is derived from presentation. And naturally so. For that which is judged must first be presented, and nothing can be presented without sense, which is irrational. Therefore, neither irrational sense nor reason is the criterion. These were the arguments by which Carneades set forth in detail in his controversy with the other philosophers, to prove the non-existence of the criterion. Yet as he, too, himself requires criterion for the conduct of life and for the attainment of happiness, he is practically compelled on his own account to frame a theory about it, and to adopt both the probable presentation and that which is at once probable and irreversible and tested. What the distinction is between these must be briefly indicated. The presentation, then, is a presentation of something, of that, for instance, from which it comes and of that in which it occurs. That from which it comes being, say, the externally existent sensible object, and that in which it occurs, say, a man. And such being its nature, it will have two aspects, one in its relation to the object presented, the second in its relation to the subject experiencing the presentation. Now, in regard to its aspect in relation to the object presented, it is either true or false. True when it is in accord with the object presented, but false when it is not in accord. But in regard to its aspect in relation to the subject experiencing the presentation, the one kind of presentation is apparently true, the other apparently false. And of these, the apparently true is termed by the academics emphasis, and probability, and probable presentation, while the not apparently true is denominated apemphasis, and unconvincing and improbable presentation, for neither that which itself appears false, nor that which, though true, does not appear so to us, is naturally convincing to us. And of these presentations, that which is evidently false, or not apparently true, is to be ruled out, and is not a criterion, whether it be derived from a non-existent object, or from an object which exists, but not in accord with that object and not representing the actual object, such as was the presentation derived from Electra which Orestes experienced, when he supposed her to be one of the Furies and cried out, "Avaunt, for of my Furies thou art one." And of the apparently true kind of presentation, one sort is obscure. The sort, for instance, that is found in the case of those who have a perception that is confused and not distinct owing to the smallness of the object viewed, or owing to the extent of the interval, or even owing to the weakness of the sense of sight. While the other sort, in addition to being apparently true, possesses this appearance of truth to an intense degree. And of these again, the presentation which is obscure and vague will not be a criterion, for because of its not indicating clearly either itself or that which caused it, it is not of such a nature as to persuade us or to induce us to assent. But that which appears true, and appears so vividly, is the criterion of truth according to the school of Carneades. And being the criterion, it has a large extension. And when extended, one presentation reveals itself as more probable and more vivid than another. Probability, in the present instance, is used in three senses. In the first, of that which both is and appears true. In the second, of that which is really false but appears true. In the third, of that which is at once both true and false. Hence, the criterion will be the apparently true presentation, which the academics called probable. But sometimes the impression it makes is actually false, so that we are compelled at times to make use of the presentation, which is at once both true and false. But the rare occurrence of this kind, the kind I mean which imitates truth, should not make us distrust the kind which, as a general rule, reports truly. For the fact is that both our judgments and our actions are regulated by the standard of the general rule. Such then is the first and general criterion according to Carneades. But since no presentation is ever simple in form, but, like links in a chain, one hangs from another, we have to add as a second criterion the presentation which is at once both probable and irreversible. For example, he who receives the presentation of a man necessarily receives the presentation both of his personal qualities and of the external conditions. Of his personal qualities such as color, size, shape, motion, speech, dress, footgear, and of the external conditions such as air, light, day, heaven, earth, friends, and all the rest. So, whenever none of these presentations disturbs our faith by appearing false, but all with one accord appear true, our belief is the greater. For we believe that this man is Socrates from the fact that he possesses all his customary qualities, color, size, shape, converse, coat, and his position in a place where there is no one exactly like him. And just as some doctors do not deduce that it is a true case of fever from one symptom only, such as too quick a pulse or a very high temperature, but from a concurrence, such as that of a high temperature with a rapid pulse, and ulcerous joints, and flushing and thirst, and analogous symptoms, so also the academic forms his judgment of truth by the concurrence of presentations. And when none of the presentations in the concurrence provokes in him a suspicion of falsity, he asserts that the impression is true, and that the irreversible presentation is a concurrence capable of implanting belief is plain from the case of Menelaus. For when he had left behind him on the ship the wraith of Helen, which he had brought with him from Troy, thinking it to be the true Helen, and had landed on the island of Pharos, he beheld the true Helen, But though he received from her a true presentation, yet he did not believe that presentation owing to his mind being warped by that other impression from which he derived the knowledge that he had left Helen behind in the ship. Such then is the irreversible presentation, and it too seems to possess extension inasmuch as one is found to be more irreversible than another. Still more trustworthy than the irreversible presentation and supremely perfect is that which creates judgment, for it, in addition to being irreversible, is also tested. What the distinctive feature of this presentation is, we must next explain. Now, in the case of the irreversible presentation, it is merely required that none of the presentations in the concurrence should disturb us by a suspicion of its falsity, but all should be apparently true and not improbable. But in the case of the concurrence which involves the tested presentation, we scrutinize attentively each of the presentations in the concurrence, just as the practice is at assembly meetings, when the people make inquiries about each of those who desire to be magistrates or judges, to see whether he is worthy to be entrusted with the magistracy or the judgeship. Thus, for example, as there are present at the seat of judgment both the subject that judges and the object that is being judged, and the medium through which judgment is effected, and distance and interval, place, time, mood, disposition, activity, we judge the distinctive character of each of these factors. As regards the subject of judging, whether its vision be not dimmed, for vision of that kind is unfitted for judging. And as regards the object judged, whether it be not excessively small. And as regards the medium through which the judgment is effected, whether the atmosphere be not dark. And as to distance, whether it be not excessively great. And as to interval, whether it be not too short. And as to place, whether it be not immense. And as to time, whether it be not brief. And as to disposition, whether it is not found to be insane. And as to activity, whether it be not unacceptable. For all these factors together form the criterion, namely, the probable presentation, and that which is at once both probable and irreversible, and besides these, that which is at once probable and irreversible and tested. And it is because of this that, just as in ordinary life, when we are investigating a small matter, we question a single witness, but in greater matter, several, and when the matter investigated is still more important, we cross-question each of the witnesses on the testimony of the others. So likewise, says Carneades, in trivial matters we employ as criterion only the probable presentation, but in greater matters the irreversible, and in matters which contribute to happiness, the tested presentation. Moreover, just as they adopt, they say, a different presentation to suit different cases, so also in different circumstances they do not cling to the same presentation, for they declare that they attend to the immediately probable in cases where the circumstances do not afford time for an accurate consideration of the matter. A man, for example, is being pursued by enemies and coming to a ditch, he receives a presentation which suggests that there, too, enemies are lying in wait for him. Then, being carried away by this presentation, as a probability, he turns aside and avoids the ditch, being led by the probability of the presentation, before he has exactly ascertained whether or not there really is an ambush of the enemy at this spot. But they follow the probable and tested presentation in cases where time is afforded for using their judgment on the object presented with the deliberation and thorough examination. For example, on seeing a coil of rope in an unlighted room, a man jumps over it, conceiving it for the moment to be a snake. But turning back afterwards, he inquires into the truth, and on finding it motionless, he is already inclined to think that it is not a snake. But as he reckons all the same, the snakes too are motionless at times when numbed by winter's frost, he prods at the coil mass with a stick, and then, after thus testing the presentation received, he assents to the fact that it is false to suppose that the body presented to him is a snake. And once again, as I said before, When we see a thing very plainly, we assent to its being true when we have previously proved by testing that we have our senses in good order, and that we see it when wide awake and not asleep, and that there exists at the same time a clear atmosphere and a moderate distance and immobility on the part of the object perceived, so that because of these conditions the presentation is trustworthy. We have had sufficient time for the scrutiny of the facts observed at the seat of the presentation. The same account is to be given of the irreversible presentation as well, for they accept it whenever there is nothing capable of controverting it, as was said above in the case of Menelaus.